And we're back with the Gaming Society Radio Hour. I'm your co-host, James.
And I'm Matthew. Our first piece of news for today is that the long-awaited Final Fantasy 15 is finally coming out relatively soon. September 30th, I believe.
Mm-hmm. This was announced at an event last Wednesday, and when we say finally, this game was announced, I believe, in 2007, maybe 2006. It was a long time ago when this game was announced, and it was originally announced as a PlayStation 3 exclusive, and it was announced as Final Fantasy 13 Versus 13 when it was announced. And after the very first time it was announced and a couple of promotional materials were released, it just sort of died away for a number of years. It wasn't at E3 or anything. And to give you a point of reference for how long ago this game was announced, even though it was reimagined into Final Fantasy 15, it was the same characters and the same plot line when it was announced as Final Fantasy 13 Versus. The entire Mass Effect series has come out in that time. The entire Assassin's Creed franchise has come out since it's been announced. Yeah, that's a lot of games. The entire music game genre craze.
The episodic game craze.
Yeah, episodic games are completely new since then. I mean, this game has been a long time coming, which is why it's such a... they re-unveiled it a few years back, that it was indeed going to be on current-gen consoles, specifically PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and that it's no longer Final Fantasy 13 versus it's Final Fantasy 15. They announced that a couple of years back, but we never actually had any sort of follow-up in terms of when is it going to be coming out exactly. But now we do. It's going to be coming out September 30th, and it has been a long time. And I guess kind of to capitalize on the fact that this is one of the first major entries in the Final Fantasy series after Final Fantasy 14, the MMO that got to a terrible, terrible start.
A terrible start, but actually, considering how much they've patched it over the last, 10 years now?
It's better.
It's actually a reasonable game at this point in time. It's just, back then it was not so critically acclaimed.
It's the Assassin's Creed Unity of the Final Fantasy universe. A game that, when it's sufficiently patched, is decent.
Yeah, I'd say Assassin's Creed Unity had other underlying technical difficulties besides the actual technical difficulties, but that's just my own personal opinion. A couple other interesting facts about Final Fantasy 15. They decided to come out with a movie, Kingsglaive, if I recall.
They're also doing a 5-part origin anime. The game, Final Fantasy 15, is about a group of young men driving around in their flying car that is also a convertible. And there's going to be a 5-part anime that serves as the origin story for how this group came together. They're also releasing a movie. So essentially, they are doing a lot of stuff to sort of campaign and market for this game outside of just releasing the game. Because also, the main theme for the game, musical theme, is by Florence and the Machine. They recorded the song Stand By Me for this game. You listen to Florence and the Machine, Matt?
I remember one of their songs, I think, vaguely.
Okay, hold on. I think I know that they're popular. I actually haven't listened to them. I did listen. I've listened to 2 songs by them. I've listened to the one that they recorded for the Great Gatsby movie,
right? Okay.
Which I enjoyed. I enjoyed that whole soundtrack. And then I've heard this song, the Stand By Me, that they recorded for Final Fantasy 15, and I like their sound. This is not a music show. This is a show about video games and nerd things like tabletop RPGs. So I'm sorry, I'm not qualified to talk about Florence and the Machine, but it is a good song. And I like the group sound.
Sure. One of the interesting parts about they're releasing a movie, right? They're releasing this full CGI movie based on the game, or at least loosely. Mm-hmm. Now, this is coming out about the same time, or at least it's being announced about the same time when the Warcraft movie is going to be coming out. That's coming out sometime in, I think, June or July this summer, actually. And so now there's going to be another video game CGI adaptation. Do you think this is going to be some kind of a new trend, where this is something that AAA developers do?
Yeah. And just to pile on that tangent, the Assassin's Creed movie franchise, and they have confirmed that it is a franchise. Same with the Splinter Cell movie franchise, even though we haven't seen any of the actual movies yet. Anyway, the Assassin's Creed movie franchise debuts this December. I think that it's admirable, to be honest, that video games, or at least movies tied to them, are trying to make their way in the world in movies. As a matter of fact, next week, the movie Hardcore Henry is coming to theaters. The movie that is being filmed with a GoPro camera, essentially. It's entirely in first person. That is drawing heavily in terms of inspiration from first-person shooters. I think that I'm going to make a bold statement.
Uh-oh.
I think that video game movies are going to be the new superhero movies.
So, have you ever heard of, I think it's Uwe Boll? I apologize to the person.
No, do divulge. I'm interested.
This is a German man who produced a whole ton of video game movies. As a matter of fact, he was really the name in video game movies. He released Blood Rain, as well as all of those sequels, or at least directed Blood Rain and all of its sequels. He made an adaptation of Postal. He made all of these movies, all of these very, very many movies that were not very good. As a matter of fact, everyone panned them entirely on IMDb. They're basically all below a 5. None of them are any good. His budgets have not been very good, and he doesn't make very good stuff. And in general, he actually more or less killed the concept of video game movies. And so the idea that these games are being translated into movies nowadays is actually quite strange to me, because back in about the early to mid 2000s, and even all the way up until Blood Rain: The Third Reich in 2011, which is not a good movie. I saw it. It's not a good movie. Even up until then, these are what people thought video game movies were, which were not very good adaptations.
To be fair, though, I mean, a lot of people did not take superhero movies seriously for a long time. And the reason that I've made such a bold statement is I think that people in the industry are putting a lot more time and effort with this sort of new generation of video game movies, especially with... I can't speak to the World of Warcraft movie, but I've been following the Assassin's Creed movie pretty closely. And, I mean, they've got Michael Fassbender working on that. And I honestly think that... I'm very excited for it. And I think that they're going about it in all the right ways. If you're going to make a video game movie, you shouldn't try to directly adapt any specific video game, which they're not with this Assassin's Creed movie. They're just sort of taking the concept of Abstergo and the concept of genetic memories and the concept of the Assassin's Brotherhood, and they're crafting an original plot with original characters and stuff along those lines. Because, I mean, a lot of video games might play like movies, which we talked about last week a little bit with walking simulators. But I do think that they are fundamentally entirely different beasts. So I'm glad that they're not just taking a specific video game in the Assassin's Creed universe and translating it to film. They're really just sort of doing their own thing, which I think is the right way to go about doing this.
I completely agree. One last part about the Kingsglaive movie is that they actually have some decent star power. They got Sean Bean of Lord of the Rings fame, as well as Lena Headey, who is in Game of Thrones. And so you would think that having such great star power would then translate over into the game, but they're actually not having those actors in the game. Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting idea that they got them specifically for the movie rather than also including them as voice actors in the game.
Yeah. Interesting little tidbit. Our next piece of news is we have a rumor coming off of, let me see here, it looks like...
NeoGAF.
Yes, NeoGAF, and reported on Eurogamer. And normally we wouldn't talk about rumors, but... we'll get into a little bit that the next Call of Duty game is going to take place to some extent, to all extent, maybe the entire game is going to be in space. It's the next Call of Duty game is going to be in space. Now, the reason that I find this to be pretty believable is that the Call of Duty Activision they have 3 different development studios now working on Call of Duty games, and they go through rotation. So, we had Sledgehammer Games develop Advanced Warfare 2 years ago. We had Treyarch develop Black Ops 3 last year, and then this year it's Infinity Ward's turn. Infinity Ward made... I know they made the first Call of Duty. I believe they also made the second Call of Duty, but then also the Modern Warfare series, which, I mean, if you average out the 3 entries, it's a pretty good series. The first 2 I'm a big fan of. And then they released Ghosts, which was significantly... I'd definitely say it was a step down compared to what Infinity Ward had produced in the past.
Most people just called it a bad game. It was universally regarded as one of the poorest installments in the franchise.
Right. But talking about this rumor that the new game is going to be taking place in space, the general Call of Duty trend, and this was sort of established with the Modern Warfare games. Modern Warfare games were essentially set present day. And then Black Ops 2 kind of took it into the near future. Advanced Warfare went even further into the future, and Black Ops 3 the furthest into the future in terms of fictional yet believable warfare being waged with drones and robots and what have you. So the fact that I have no problem believing that the Call of Duty franchise is going to sort of continue into the future, further in time into the future. Also, if Infinity Ward chooses to make a direct sequel to Ghosts, which when they released Ghosts, they definitely intended to. I'm not going to spoil anything necessarily specific, but it did end on a cliffhanger in the sense that you knew that Infinity Ward did, at the time of releasing the first game, intend for them to release another game. They intended this to be a franchise, Ghosts. They intended it to be a franchise just like they intended Modern Warfare to be a franchise. So if they do a direct sequel to Ghosts, I also have no hard time believing that it will take place in space, or at least some part of it will, because there are extended sequences, extended action sequences in the Ghost campaign that take place in space, that you're having gunfights in space, and that while that sounds ludicrous, and yes it is, it's not out of place to believe that a future Call of Duty game would have set pieces set in space.
I mean, it's not the first time a Call of Duty game would ever go into space. I mean, I think that was in Black Ops 1, I want to say, with the Moon DLC, when you could play a zombies map where you could essentially get to the moon at one point during it.
The first time that I remember was when a WMD went off over Washington, D.C. in Modern Warfare 2, and there was about a 30-second segment where you couldn't shoot anything. You could just sort of look around when you were an astronaut in space in Modern Warfare 2 campaign, and you got to sort of see that and play through that. That was the first time I remember So yeah, I mean, Call of Duty been in space before. It could go in space again.
I mean, especially if they want to try to be like some of the more popular first-person shooters of the recent era, like Wolfenstein, the latest installment, which did have lengthy sequences, which were set in space, which were regarded well at the time. So most likely they're going to be going for something like that, which would be cool.
Mm-hmm. So, Matt, do you want to introduce us to our last piece of news here before we interrupt?
Certainly. All right. So there is a game called Overwatch. It is a character first-person shooter, which means that instead of being yourself, more or less, you pick a certain character. Each one is essentially some different type of archetype. You have the really speedy scout type of a unit, which is extremely fast but has low health and has certain abilities. And each character has their own unique abilities, and each team is made up of different characters that people select.
Is it safe to say that this is sort of Blizzard's answer to Team Fortress 2?
Exactly. Except it has more characters, more variety, that sort of thing, and just overall, in my opinion, it's turning out to be what will likely be a better game. Of course, it's not free, so that's a definitely larger difference. Now, what happened recently is that there was some controversy over one of the poses that one of the character has. Now, one of the ways that Blizzard made this game have some type of replay value is it made there be these unlockable poses that you can get for the characters. There's other unlockables as well, but this is the portion of it that I'm going to focus on, is the poses, where the characters will do some type of thing which is reminiscent of their character. Each one has this large, long backstory that has all this lore, and so each character then has poses based off of that. Like there's a giant monkey character, ape character, Winston, who will do all sorts of ape things, and then there are different costumes for him as well that you can unlock, like a safari one. And so what was really cool about this was that each one had a pose which was based on its character. However, this is where things get problematic because some people have different views on what the characters are. There is a character in the game named Tracer. And this character came under controversy recently where somebody posted on the Overwatch forums that there was a specific pose that Tracer did which was very much out of her character. It was a pose where she is essentially facing away from the camera so that her butt is in plain view of the camera. This so-called butt pose was regarded as being too sexual, and so since it was a character which was not based around flaunting their sexuality, and in fact, in none of the other poses or any of the lore seemed to be indicative of that type of a character, it felt very much out of place in this game, which was all about character building and all about making these characters feel unique and feel powerful. Now, one thing that's important to know is that there are other characters in this game which are very sexual. There's a character named Widowmaker, which is a character that flaunts her sexuality, and because of that, she is very much allowed to do these poses, or at least according to this post on the forum. Now, Blizzard heard this cry out from the audience and heard all the people who were also agreeing with this person on the forums and stated that, this actually makes a lot of sense. We were also looking at this pose and we felt it didn't fit her character very well, and so we decided to take it out and replace it with something else that really we think fits her better. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed with that. Many people stated that it was some type of censorship in gaming and that people should just learn to deal with it, and that, Blizzard is okay with cartoon violence, but once they bring out cartoon sexuality, it's a problem. And honestly, sexuality can be empowering. You can have this sexuality be empowering, and it is with Widowmaker. It is with other characters. However, at least in my opinion, from what I know of Tracer, it very much was against her character. And so for me anyway, it made sense for them to take that out. And since they kept it with other characters, it feels like they were not just bowing down to the audience on this, and they were actually going with what they thought was rational game design.
Yeah, because I think the important distinction there is that there are a lot of, or I don't know if a lot, but there are a couple of characters who are, as a part of their character, supposed to be more sexualized, and they still have these poses, but it's just sort of this uncomfortable bit of out-of-character posing that got a lot of people riled up. And I would like just to add the statement from Blizzard, just a little quote, and that is, "Well, that escalated quickly." Okay. I just think that's gold. Matt and I here are going to be taking a break, but we'll be right back. This is McAllister Radio, WMCN 91.7. Welcome back to the McAllister Gaming Society Radio Hour. I'm your co-host, James.
And I'm Matthew.
And the song that we just played is the song Obstacles by the artist Sid Matters from the game Life is Strange, which is a personal favorite of myself, Matt, and John. And Matt, you pitched this game a couple weeks back.
I did, that's right, and I still think it's a fantastic game.
I hadn't played it at the time that you pitched it. However, I have since played it, and I must say it is one of my absolute favorite games. Very good episodic game. And, I mean, there are some good episodic games out there. My opinion is not that they are all bad, contrary to what you may or may not believe from a previous episode of this show. Very good game. And today, we are joined with special guest host
John Ratz.
And it's time for our feature. And today for our feature, we are going to be talking about horror RPGs. John, why don't you do a little bit and introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about why you're here?
So I'm here because I love horror RPGs. They are my favorite genre of RPG. So since I've come to McAllister, I've basically run a horror RPG every semester in some way or another. The first semester, for about half the semester, I ran a game called Hunter, which is about basically being Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but like not just Buffy. And then next semester, a game called Vampire, which is about being vampires. And then next semester, which is last semester, playing a game called Changeling, which is about fairies, but it's still scary. And this semester, I'm running a series of one-shots like every other week or so called Scream Machine, which is some fun stuff. I'm actually running a game tonight.
Yeah, right after the show, right?
Yeah, I'm going right to the room, basically.
And as it so happens, just to establish the horror RPG cred of Matt and I am actually GMing a game set in the Trail of Cthulhu setting. And Matt, you're a PC in that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a character in James's RPG. I play a badass thief. It's cool.
Yeah, basically, Matt and his crew are an elite police division, Whitechapel division, as it were, hunting down the Ripper in 1888 London.
Or at least that's how it started. It sort of evolved over time to be something a little more sinister.
Yeah, most of my games are less competent protagonists. They're usually a bunch of schmucks.
So, yeah, a lot of what you're running this semester, John, are one-shots, as opposed to longer campaigns.
Can you tell us what a one-shot is?
So like a one-shot is a game that like happens in one session, usually 3 to 4 hours. In like some rare cases, you might be like, oh, we don't have enough finished, so maybe we'll do it one more time. But it's like you're not trying to do something for months on end. It's just once.
So it's sort of like one episode versus a whole series.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe even like a short movie. But yeah, pretty much just one-off.
All right. And why don't you talk a little bit about what exactly it is about horror RPGs that you enjoy so much as opposed to other tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, so I've like had experience in multiple genres of role-playing. And like right now, for example, I'm playing a game that's like in the drama system, which is more about emotions and such. But something about horror, I guess the thing that gets me the most is that fear is like an emotion that's not, I wouldn't say easy to evoke, but it's like easy to feel, you know? It's like you feel it more than most other emotions. Like if you're like sad over someone, yeah, that's strong, but like being just viscerally scared of something is like something that's just instinct. So like evoking those feelings in others or having them evoked in me is what really brings me back to horror. Actually, I have a game here, which is the game I'm going to be running tonight called Dead of Night by Steam Power Publishing. And there's a chapter about like theory of game, basically, and it has a little quote I'd like to read where by Mark Latham, who says, "One of the things I like best about horror roleplay, and the reason I always come back to the genre as a game master, is the opportunity to create a genuinely chilling atmosphere. Sure, there are times when it doesn't quite work, or your players are the kind who won't be truly scared by events around the gaming table, but when it does work, when the players can at least understand the horror that their characters face and act accordingly, that's when the rewards for the game master are, in my opinion, greater than in any other genre of game."
Okay, so you've talked a little bit about why you enjoy horror so much and why it's such a great genre, but how do you make it good? How do you make good horror versus sort of bad horror? There's all sorts of horror games, movies, TV shows, everything out there. Not all of it's all that good. So what really makes it good?
So I think that you kind of get like the first step is like even before you're playing the game is that you've got to make sure you got the right group of people. Like if you've got a bunch of friends that really just want to like joke around and make it funny, they're like going to not be in the mood to play a horror game where they're going to get scared. But like once you've found a group of people who are like willing to be scared, which is an important part because also like consent to feel the feelings you're going to feel is important in any game. But like, you find the right group. And then it becomes about, it's kind of hard to say, but it's just like things that are genuinely terrifying, but also giving the players freedom to like choose how the horror goes, you know? Because like this isn't a movie. The slasher isn't always going to kill the people in the same way. You need to make it fresh and give it some possibilities. But like still, one of the things that I like to say is that I give them freedom, but I also make sure that I have some set pieces in mind, so to speak, like visual things often, or just experiences or encounters that are always going to be in the game in some way or another that are going to be shocking because you don't come up with those on the seat of your pants usually.
Can you give us an example of one of those set pieces, something that you're proud of?
Actually, I'll go with two. Yeah, because I'm proud of both, but in different ways. So last semester, I was running the game of Changeling, which, you know, like I said, fairies. And if you don't think that's scary, you don't know shit about fairy tales. But anyway, there was a event where somebody's parent was in their house and actually got killed by a vine, like a rose vine noose thing, and it was like hard to explain, but honestly like everyone was shocked even though they kind of expected bad stuff to happen. And then another one, I was playing a one shot and like a monster that the group had been facing came out of the woodwork basically after they thought they were safe, and I just played this roar sound effect on my computer and everyone just went at once. Yeah.
So you've talked a little bit about certain set pieces. What are some of your favorite tropes, I guess, horror tropes to include in your games? What sort of tropes do you think can sometimes be more effective than others in your experience? What are some fun ones or scary ones that you found that you like to include in your games?
This is less of like a specific trope, but I think it's an important thing to consider in role-playing games, is that I make sure the players know beforehand that character death is going to be a thing, because, you know, it's usually a one-shot, so, you know, like they've got to be cool with like their characters, you know, exiting stage right, so to speak, often in gruesome fashion. But yeah, it's like, it's having things that, in terms of actual tropes, though, isolation, super important one. You don't want it to be believable that the characters could just walk out of the situation at any time. And besides that, it's usually just a grab bag of other tropes from horror, like, you know, slashers and unstoppable monsters, that sort of thing.
But then also, is there a certain vein of horror that you enjoy more or gravitate to more often? I mean, for example, I am running a game this semester, like I said, in Trail of Cthulhu, and that system is set up to be more Lovecraftian in its style of horror, but instead of running it like that, I'm running it in more of a gothic sort of setting instead. but you also mentioned that there's sort of the slasher sort of genre that can play into your games. So what sort of different genres or veins of horror do you really sort of enjoy?
Actually, I'd say that Gothic I also go with a lot because my favorite system is World of Darkness, which has got a ton of books written about it. It's been out since the 90s. It's got maybe the best setting of any other horror RPGs, but it has its most popular game is Vampire, which has a strong Gothic bent, and I think that extends to a lot of its other games too, like Changeling, like Hunter, which are all under World of Darkness. But otherwise, I like monster, just like straight up monster movies sort of things, because it's fun to like come up with a monster and just set it upon an unsuspecting group of people. But yeah, I'd say that those are probably my favorite genres. Yeah.
So you really enjoy sort of the tabletop RPG horror systems. What are the key differences that make that one so much more appealing to you than, say, horror in books, movies, video games, other things?
Well, my secret is that I'm actually like very cowardly when it comes to a lot of horror media. For example, like one time I tried to watch PT, which is playable teaser for Silent Hills, with my friends, just watching a playthrough. And suffice to say, we got so scared that I just crawled to my computer to pause it without looking at the screen. But yeah, I'm like not. So horror movies like get me scared really easy, but usually I'm the game master when I'm playing a horror game, and it's like it's fun to inspire those feelings in other people who want to participate in it. Sometimes it's a lot to experience it yourself. I've gotten better about it, but like it's fun to know like what all the moving parts behind the horror is.
So if someone else were running a horror RPG, you would perhaps not partake in that? You might not enjoy it as much?
I would probably give it a chance now, but it's like I also like I'd like to think I trust myself the most with the horror genre.
You had mentioned before using sound effects and the like with some of the games that you run. Is that something that you do very often, where you use more than just the dice and your ability to narrate as the GM and use sound effects, or do you ever use visual aids or anything like that to sort of add to the overall effect of how scary this game is?
Yeah, I often joke with my friend Jake about like multimodal presentations are an important part of horror games. It's a lot of work though, so I don't do it very often. I'd say the time I've done it the most is in the one shot I mentioned with like the monster that came out of the woodwork, where it was like I spent 2 weeks writing that scenario from the ground up, and like I had certain scenes and I put certain music with certain scenes, and I also came up with a bunch of sound effects. Actually, the best sound effects for monster roars are, surprisingly enough, super slowed down and distorted versions of people pulling a straw through a lid. It's terrifying. It sounds like it's straight out of hell itself.
Well, you heard it first on this show. I guess another question that I have for you. So I'm running this show. I mean this game.
You're also running the show.
And well, yes, Matt and I running this game, Betrayal of Cthulhu, which is Gothic, but I'd say it's just as much scary game or Gothic as it is an investigative RPG. Mm-hmm. So what that means is, on my part, I'm putting in quite a number of hours preparing for each different session that we have. Mm-hmm. When you're doing a one-shot or a campaign that isn't necessarily as investigative and just horror, how much time do you spend sort of meticulously crafting these scenarios so that they'll scare the players, and how much of it do you just sort of leave up to the way that the PCs interact with the world that you create, and more of an organic scare?
I'd say that a lot of horror, even ones that aren't investigative based as Betrayal of Cthulhu is, has some bit of an investigation to it, because the unknown being an important part of horror. But in my case, I always found that I was over preparing, especially for my campaign games. that like I prepared too much material, and really that the best scary stuff happened when I let go of the preparations and kind of let people go off and just had my set pieces in mind, but like let them get to it in their own way. But I'll say that I think a thing that changed that is that a lot of the games I've played have the characters playing monsters or supernatural creatures. So it was often like, what horror can the characters make for themselves? Like, for example, in my vampire game, people went to some pretty dark places with their characters, and Changeling as well. So it was always interesting to see when they like one-upped me, and I enjoyed that.
Are there any and this is broad strokes, and it's not necessarily going to be true for every horror RPG system out there, but are there any sort of qualms that you might have with the genre, just in the way that a lot of the games are set up? Are there any sort of facets that you wish were a little different across horror role-playing games?
I'd say that, there's like issues with horror as a genre that like go beyond role-playing games, like final girl and slasher things, and like, morality playing a huge role, like sexual morality being like, you survive if you're pure, which is like a really, really bad message. And it's just, but in RPG specifically, I'd say mental health is a huge thing that I think gets not treated with the like respect it deserves a lot of times, because there's a lot of games that have like that boil down sanity to like a meter, and if you do things, you lose points off that meter, and then you go insane, which is really not how mental health works. Maybe when Cthulhu monsters are around, but like for example, in the original drafts of the New World of Darkness, which I play a lot, you had a morality score, and if you did immoral actions, you basically had to roll to see if you got a random mental illness. And even if you don't know a lot about mental illness, you know that shooting someone doesn't give you bipolar disorder. They changed that in the new edition, and I'm very thankful for that, because they explicitly talked about that, and they like development blogs. They were like, we realized that we were stigmatizing a bunch of people with inaccurate depictions of mental health. So I'd say that's a pretty big issue.
I'm curious, you mentioned you can lose ticks off of your mental health score. If you do an immoral action, I'm curious who or what got to be the judge, or what exactly, in terms of the game, if you could elaborate a little bit on what exactly constituted an immoral action. You mentioned shooting someone. Or?
Yeah, well, for example, in the game I played with the protagonists as vampires, murdering humans was a bad thing. Because, you can play a game when you're just, like you're a vampire and you're just, don't care about the consequences and cause a lot of suffering. But, the whole game is based on the divide between your humanity and your bestial side, basically. So, for example, for regular people in World of Darkness, it's morality score, or it used to be. It's different now. And for vampires, it was humanity, because, different struggles if you're a vampire versus a regular human. So it's also up to me a lot of the time to be like, you killed the person, you should feel bad about that. Yeah.
So how has the horror genre evolved over time, and what do you think it'll look like in the future?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'd say that horror in RPGs, goes way back, and I'm not sure if I could give you a first example, but even back in the early editions of D&D, we had Ravenloft with Strahd, who was a vampire, and just got reintroduced actually in a recent module in D&D.
Good for him.
Yeah, but I'd say that it really got into gear with Vampire the Masquerade being released in the 90s. And so the 90s being a time when there were a lot of goths going to high school, the horror genre took off. And so, yeah, I just think that World of Darkness, that was the first edition way back when, was probably what kicked it all off. And there's a lot of smaller indie games around, like Dread, where you use a Jenga tower, or, for example, Dead of Night, like I'm playing tonight, which is, smaller, more interesting mechanics. Yeah, you can retool it how it fits.
So it sounds like it's gotten a lot more inventive in terms of. I mean, now you can play horror games with Jenga towers. John, I was actually in a game of yours, a one shot where we played with tarot cards. that was really fun. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's like a really simple little system called Grin, which somebody made based on Dread. So, like, Dread, based on Jenga, basically the rule is, like, you pull Jenga blocks out when you try to do things, and if the tower falls, you basically die. But I was like, there's some problems with this. Number one, if you don't have a really old Jenga set, that tower doesn't fall for a really long time. And two, if you have a player who has like an essential tremor or something in their handshakes, they're much more likely to die earlier. So I was like, let's look for an alternate rule system. And Grin was there, and it basically runs with a regular deck of cards. You just draw, and when you get the Joker, you die. But I thought, this is a horror game, all right? Let's get some tarot cards in here. Let's throw in the major arcana. So that's a lot of fun. It also gives me license to be like, it's not my fault your character died. You drew the death card. I'm just here to deal it out, which is rather satisfying.
If you were going to make a horror system, what kinds of elements would you use? Would you use a tarot card deck? What kinds of systems would you want to have in it? Like mental health, it sounds like, would be one that you would want to include in there.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I would. I think for me, there's almost always something there for me that I can just change to suit me. So when I think about it, I usually wouldn't build it from the ground up. I'd probably take things like from Grin. I would love to use a tarot deck. I don't know how you would do it, but like a Ouija board would be cool to work into a horror RPG. But like, yeah, I would definitely include systems for mental health, but I would make them so that they fit into the horror genre, but also weren't completely like distanced from reality. But yeah, it's basically like I would take tools that I've seen in all other games and put it together to make what I liked the best. I'd probably put some dice in there too, because I have too many dice to justify making a game without dice.
That's fair. So, Are there any other really interesting mechanics that you've seen in other sort of random horror games that you'd kind of like to do a shout out for? You mentioned the Jenga Tower, or your own kind of homebrew of Grin where you use tarot cards. Are there any other really just sort of unique mechanics in horror games that you'd like to do a little bit of a shout out to?
Yeah, I keep shouting out Dead of Night, but I'll do it again. They have a really cool little score called the tension in the game, and the tension affects a couple things, like how you describe things is affected by the tension. So, for example, at low tension, things that are pretty scary don't actually seem that scary because it's not that tense. But as it gets more tense, things get scarier. But also, and my favorite part is you can spend points of tension to affect how your players roll. You can make them fail what they thought they won. You can turn a near miss into a hit. It's pretty fun. I'm guessing it will annoy some of my players tonight, but I'll have a lot of fun with it.
So does that that last little bit where you can spend points, that almost sounds like you're putting some of the power back in the player's hands in terms of being able to change the narrative a little bit, something that is usually reserved for the GM. Would you say that that's true, or? Actually,
that's my role as a GM. I get to spend the points.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
But I think that in the horror genre, like, there's a lot of room for players to add things themselves. Like, if somebody has a very scary thing that they want to add to the narrative, who am I to stop them from creeping out their friends around the table? And there's a lot of games that like give you space to do that. Not so much some of the ones that I'm talking about, but you can be like, you can work together with the GM to scare yourself if you're a really, really good player.
All right, so we are just about out of time with John here. So at the end, John, we usually work in some sort of pitches for games that we think people should be playing, and I think it would be appropriate if we were to pitch horror game systems.
Okay.
So I am going to pitch the Trail of Cthulhu system, which I talked about a little bit before. It's the game system that I'm running. It runs on the mechanics set forth in the Gumshoe system, and it's sort of a marriage between the Call of Cthulhu RPG and the Gumshoe system, where it's meant to be roughly 1920s. It's meant to be Lovecraftian, but I mean, like a lot of RPGs, it's pretty malleable. Like I said, I'm setting it back a couple decades and in London and Gothic, but it also has a strong sort of investigative lean to it, which, while it's a lot of work for the GM, is really rewarding to see your PCs, as Matt here can testify, as he's one of mine, really get involved in the mystery and in the trial at hand. So that's my pitch. Matt?
I played a game a long time ago. It was one of the first times I'd ever played a complicated board game, and it was called Betrayal at the House on the Hill. And it terrified me. It terrified me that night when we were up late at night. Played it for 3 hours long and never got tired of it. It's a whole bunch of adventurers that get trapped in this strange, spooky house, and it turns out over time that one of them is actually the traitor, and they want to kill them all, and there's tons of different scenarios, lots of fun. I enjoy it. It's good. It's a good time.
It's always exciting when the traitor is the small child. I think I'll shout out all of the games that I mentioned, but I'll also shout out a video game that I would like to do for horror. It's called Oxenfree. It's a really nice, really simple little story-based horror game that's group of teenagers in a scary setting. It's very good.
All right, fantastic. So yeah, that wraps things up for John here. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been really fun to talk about horror with you. That just about wraps up our show. This has been the Gaming Society Radio Hour. I'm your co-host, James.
And I'm Matthew.
And I'd just like to thank, again, John for coming in and letting us interview him about horror RPGs. It's fun. We've been meaning to have more guest stars on our show, so we're hoping that this is something we get to do more in the future. Anyway, until next time, thank you for listening.